on today's World Insight with Tian Wei. The war of words heats up as the DPRK conducts an important missile test. How can we solve the Korean Peninsula impasse? And the world's biggest trading bloc in the making, how will RCEP shift the new global economic center? And here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's show on the Korean Peninsula, where the DPRK has carried out what it calls a very important test. U.S. President Donald Trump fired back at that DPRK leader Kim Jong-un risks losing what he called everything. These exchanges of threats and insults seem a world away from the past three historic summits between the two leaders. Before we get down to the discussion about exactly what's the real essence of this relationship with the latest analysis, let's take a look at this first.
Tensions are rising on the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK said it has conducted a very significant test at its Sohae space satellite launch site, which will impact the country's strategic position in the near future. State media did not specify what was tested, but the site has previously been used to launch rockets as well as test missile engines. This came ahead of a year-end deadline, after which Pyongyang warns it could take a new path amid stalled talks with the U.S. And the DPRK ambassador to the United Nations said denuclearization was now off the negotiating table and lengthy talks with Washington are not needed. Earlier at a NATO summit, Mr. Trump took aim at the DPRK leader.
Like sending rockets up, doesn't he? That's why I call him Rocket Man.
Meanwhile, South Korea said that it is closely monitoring the DPRK's activities with the U.S. And China said that the major parties should work together to solve the issues while DPRK-US negotiations have stalled. Trump and Kim Jong-un have met 3 times since 2018 in Singapore, Hanoi, and Panmunjom, but they failed to reach an agreement on the steps of denuclearization, and now it seems tensions are escalating. The UN Security Council met on Wednesday at the request of the U.S. over the significant test, but no one knows what will happen next.
So for the latest analysis on the DPRK missile test, we have in Seoul Yoon-jung Lim, who is an associate professor at the Division of International Studies at Koongju National University. Welcome to the program. In Boston, we have Jim Walsh, a senior research associate at MIT Security Studies Program. Welcome as well. Last but not least, in Beijing studio, Yang Xiyu, senior research fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Let me begin by asking you, Ms. Lim, since you are based in South Korea, probably the closest among all of us, what do you make of the timing of the so-called important test?
I still would be a little bit cautious, or I would love to be still, again, hesitant to evaluate the real meaning of the specific test. It is true, again, they used the Dongchang-ri again, which was one of the agreement, actually. They already agreed that they're going to close the Dongchang-ri, but they used this Dongchang-ri test site for this significant, important test. But at the same time, they didn't actually reveal that what exactly the test was aiming for. So they are sending some kind of mixed, ambivalent signals, to the rest of the world. But it might be very fair to say that they are trying to have another round of the serious dialogues, negotiations with Washington before the deadline they determine, which is, again, the end of this year.
Yeah, certainly the timing is very important. How important really indeed is it? It's not just what's going on between the two countries, DPRK and the United States, but also, Mr. Walsh, if I could also remind people of the politics going on in Washington, D.C. and the election season next year.
Yes, in fact, President Trump tweeted that he didn't want North Korea, in a bit of irony, if you ask me, to interfere in the U.S. general election by causing provocations during the election season. You know, I think the timing is important. I think this is just the latest in a series of different actions, statements delivered, testing of missiles, other sorts of behaviors that all point to the fact that probably by the end of the year, North Korea is going to take some sort of major action in violation of whatever the Singapore summit agreed to. I think the testing at this facility may be a bit of signaling. It's a facility that in the past produced rocket engines, including rocket engines for satellite missile tests, in addition to military missiles. And when I talk to people in the U.S. government or who have retired from the U.S. government, I think they still hold out hope, but they're very clear, and I was in Washington last week, they're very clear that they expect North Korea to move forward, as they've been threatening to do for a year, for a solid year. They will move forward with some major provocation by the end of the year or early next year.
But Mr. Walsh, if I could remind you also, the Singapore summit was very, very long time ago. After that, there was also a Vietnam summit, and there was also some very dramatic moments on the border between North and South Korea, in which President Trump was participating, but did not reach both sides any kinds of momentum, shall we put it that way, confirm the momentum. So I wonder whether it is correct for Washington to accuse Pyongyang of violating anything, as there was nothing that actually reached. Mr. Walsh, just quickly to you, and then I'll move on to the other guest.
Yes, they're anticipating. Now, to be clear, they're not claiming that there's been a violation so far. What they're saying is they expect, as the North Koreans have repeatedly said month after month, and recently this month, that they were not going to return to the negotiating table, and that they were not going to do denuclearization. So they expect that to happen, you know, sometime over the next 2 or 3 weeks.
I see. Mr. Yang, in Beijing, certainly Beijing is a big player always for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But Mr. Yang, since China and the U.S. right now are participating in something that both countries did not experience over the past, shall we say, 3 decades or 4, how should we understand, from Beijing's perspective, what's going on between Pyongyang and Washington now?
Well, the latest negative development is really sad thing for Beijing. In other words, Beijing hates to see the latest provocative development between the U.S. and DPRK. Although U.S. and China relation is in really bad shape. But I would say, if you look at the past 2 decades experiences of China-U.S. cooperation on the North Korean nuclear issue, we will see the very clear picture. On one hand, the general U.S.-China relation is in fluctuating, but on the other hand, the cooperation between the two remain keeping stability. So at this moment, no matter how bad and how complicated the relation in general, the cooperation between the two remain stable. And regarding to the latest development, I think, at least, I focus on the question, not the question what they test, but I focus the question of what is the intention or purpose for the test. Does North Korea want to make use of the test to break off, to derail the possible negotiation, or the opposite, say, push for the negotiation? And my conclusion and answer is the latter. Say, the test, the provocative test, was designed to create a unique environment for negotiation, not for confrontation.
Ms. Lim, you see the U.S. president is quite a busy person, I have to say, right now, particularly at the end of the year, with the impeachment trial going on, inquiry going on, rather, and also U.S.-China trade dispute, as well as other aspects of China-U.S. relations, now going out of the usual norm, and also the fact that there is an election season. There might be very different views within his own party as to who will be the candidate and what is the direction the U.S. should be heading for. So in that regard, will the U.S. president, do you think, be able to participate in any kind of serious discussion on the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Even if he promised anything, would he be able to walk his talk?
That question really is actually it makes me painful. I mean, that is really the reality. I can actually agree more with your that critical observation because I have many years in Washington D.C. and as far as I know, to the Washington's policymakers or even just ordinary U.S. citizens, American citizens. North Korea's that kind of provocations or denuclearization, CVID or whatever those acronyms stand for, that's actually really not the #1 priority, especially to the electorate, again the American voters. That's really the reality, and that is why one of the major reasons why all these negotiations really were delayed and delayed and delayed. Again, from the Washington's perspective, that has probably, I would dare to say that there was not really the #1 priority. Probably now Pyongyang really knows it, and Pyongyang probably feel really obsessed with again the dialogues, negotiations with Washington. So Mr. Yang actually mentioned about their real intentions. What is their calculation behind the specific test? That's really the big questions. But as I said earlier, I would say they really want to have a serious talk with Washington before, again, too late. So again, we do see a kind of gap here between the Washington's temperature and the Pyongyang's temperature.
And Mr. Walsh from MIT certainly has been waving his head. You do not agree with our South Korean guest?
I do not agree whatsoever. I certainly respect your point of view, but I don't see any evidence for that. Steve Biegun has repeatedly tried to engage the North Koreans in negotiations. The North Koreans walked out in the Stockholm meeting. He sent a proposal to meet again in December. Kim Jong-il rejected that and said they wouldn't talk. It's not at all the situation that the North Koreans haven't had an opportunity to talk to Washington and that Washington is slow playing this. Washington would like to get an agreement so Trump has a feather in his cap when he runs for re-election.
That's exactly my question, Mr. Walsh, if I could. That is, this is certainly being regarded as a coin in his pocket, the DPRK nuclear issue, by President Trump. You could see that in his rhetorics over the past few years. And his actions on the border between the North and the South. Certainly this is going to be a great PR campaign for him. However, he did not manage to reach anything during the last summit in Vietnam. Even though there were some kinds of olive branches being extended to DPRK, but it was only much later when he himself was in very much political trouble in Washington that he did what you just mentioned. So obviously, from Pyongyang or anybody, there would be a very much a delayed enthusiasm, I would assume, before they could try to figure out what is the real nature of this offer of olive branch. Mr. Walsh, very briefly.
Yeah, the way you test that is you negotiate. You just don't sit on your hands and never meet. I blame the U.S. for how they handled the Hanoi summit. I think John Bolton deserves a share of blame for that. But coming out of that, there have been ample opportunities for the sides to talk if they wanted to talk. North Korea has refused. Now, you can argue that the U.S. doesn't have a good proposal. Fine, that's certainly a reasonable argument. But the only way you resolve that is if you show up, and the North Koreans have either not shown up or shown up and walked out. Now, I agree with our Chinese colleague. I think there's going to be a satellite launch. And then the question is that a crisis that creates a new opportunity for negotiation, or is it a crisis that leads to a downward spiral? I think that's what we're looking at over the next month.
All right.
And I agree with my Chinese colleague that it may create a positive opportunity, but it's going to be touch and go, believe me.
All right. Mr. Yang, you've been working on this issue for a long time, since almost the very start of the six-party talks in various roles. So tell me, how do you see, when other circumstances evolving, the nuclear issue on the DPRK would also be changing in terms of its nature, and how Pyongyang, over the decades, have been able to grasp the essence of that and make the best use of that, Mr. Yang?
Well, let me put it back this way. Nuclear items plus ICBM, ballistic missiles, are their really limited capitals for making deal. They need to use them carefully and calculatedly, no matter it's a miscalculation or right calculation. Under the current situation, I think all they have done recently are designed to a better deal rather than for confrontation. And the nuclear issue, I think they have a dream, say, step by step, partially elimination of nuclear, and got what they want. And maybe if we are lucky, we can give all they want, and then they are credible and give us all we want. But maybe that's not. But at least they think under the current game they have made some down payment. That is North Korean's logic, in my observation. Their argument is they have done three things: dismantling the test site, or nuclear test site, and removing the launching pad, and also promising to remove some things at Liangbian. And meanwhile, U.S. has done nothing from their point of view. So we can blame North Korea, say you have no intention to negotiate. But their logic is, we have done something. Now it's your turn. So I'm here to wait for your thing. You should do like we have unilaterally did previously.
Okay.
So now, in short, different logic met together composed such a complicated situation.
If I can, Mr. Yang, follow up very quickly, an answer from you as well. We see the strategic relationships among other important players in the earlier rounds of six-party talks. The other five players, for example, have been changing apparently dramatically, at least over the past year. China and U.S., Japan, South Korea, Japan, China, China, South Korea, Russia, United States, and the list goes on. So how do you think Pyongyang over the past decades have a sophisticated understanding to what degree of the nature of these relationships and how they're likely to work it out now as a result of these apparent huge changes? Mr. Yang.
I think if Pyongyang has a very clear source, they should recognize that there's a little room for manipulating the differences and the contradictions among the other five players, although during the past 10 years, the contradictions and the relations are getting more complicated among the related parties. Because on the issue, on the question of denuclearization among the five, the consensus remain unchanged.
I see. Well, the DPRK's recent missile test altered the country's strategic capacity, some say. In 2017, the DPRK launched its Hwasong 15 missile with a range that could reach the United States east coast. The DPRK's missile tests were halted in the year 2018 when they agreed to a voluntary moratorium of long-range missiles. However, 2019 saw the DPRK resumed short-range missile tests under the current circumstances. And then on October the 2nd, they tested a submarine-launched ballistic missile. And on December the 7th, we all know they conducted another very important test in their words. So given all of these latest developments, Ms. Kim, Ms. Lim, how do you think? Where are we heading for the end of this year and almost we can, if you can, to the end of the U.S. election season? Maybe that is a calendar we have to observe. Ms. Lim.
I think this week and next week, these 2 weeks will be really important. Because as we all know, I mean, tomorrow in New York City, they will have a UN Security Council meeting, which was suggested by Washington this time. The U.S. is also trying to, I think, send a kind of mixed signals. Again, they want to remain hopeful for the dialogues, negotiations, more diplomatic solutions. But at the same time, they also want to keep the political pressure over unnecessary, from their point of view, unnecessary offensive behavior by Pyongyang. So it's, we really need to be cautious and careful to see this, again, the result outcomes of the UN Security Council meeting tomorrow. And the next week, Mr. Biden, he's coming to the South Korea too. So as long as the working level, as long as they can create more like a constructive solutions for this time, again, I want to remain hopeful. But probably last time, again, at the Hanoi, from my perspective, I feel like, you know, there have been a kind of miscommunications or miscalculation of Pyongyang. Pyongyang probably, they assumed that Yongbyon itself will be more than enough, but it was not enough, I mean, for Washington. So definitely this time, we need to have a more like a constructive solutions, prescriptions for the future progress.
Also, I want to ask briefly from Mr. Walsh, with the Washington Post, with the latest article revealing the quote-unquote behind-the-scenes strategies and rhetoric coming from President Trump regarding South Korea and regarding U.S. military in South Korea, I wouldn't go through all the articles exactly what's being described. But Mr. Walsh, what do you think might be happening from now until the U.S. election comes to a result?
Well, I think if things go badly, President Trump, when things go badly, he tends to blame people, whether they deserve the blame or not. I expect he will blame, unfortunately, President Moon if things do not go well. He'll continue to try to say nice things about Mr. Kim with the hope that maybe they can still save something here. But he'll have to blame someone, and I'm afraid that's going to affect U.S.-South Korean bilateral relations negatively. As I look to the future, I think we're going to get a big provocation. And then the question is, does that, you know, lead to a new negotiation, or does it lead to crisis? I think the North Koreans think Trump is weak, and so they're trying to pressure him in an election year, and they think he's going to roll over, and we're just going to, and that's a bet. And if they're wrong, then, you know, there'll be things that, consequences that flow from that. But that's what I think is happening. The North Koreans think Trump is weak, and so they're pushing him as we zoom in here towards the election.
Mr. Yang, final words to you as well.
2 points of idea. Firstly, holding on making conclusions from UNSC, and secondly, U.S. and DPRK, please have an unconditional meeting before UNSC takes some conclusion, so that we can have a new chance for turning around.
Well, at least the analysts believe so. We'll see how the political leadership are reacting to our suggestions. For now, I want to thank the three of you joining us for this discussion, certainly with your own perspectives, all respected. Jim Walsh, Yun-Jung Lim, and Yang Xiyu. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our live program. The world's biggest trade bloc in the making. How will RCEP or RCEP shift the new global economic and trade center? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. After more than 6 years of negotiation, more than a dozen countries in the Asia-Pacific are now aiming to sign what will be the world's largest trade agreement in 2020, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, also known as RCEP. Last week, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce said 15 member states have undertaken legal scrubbing, the final stage before its formal signing. Accounting for nearly a third of global GDP, how will RCEP, reshape regional and global trade? Before we get down to discussion with our panelists from different countries, take a look at this first.
An emerging mega trade deal among 15 Asia-Pacific countries will be a game-changer for closer economic integration. RCEP is crossing its last hurdle. with officials aiming to sign the agreement in February or March 2020. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce said that the 15 economies had concluded text-based negotiations for all 20 chapters.
RCEP 15个成员
We noted 15 RCEP participating countries have concluded text-based negotiations for all 20 chapters and essentially all their market access issues, and tasked legal review and correction to commence for signing in 2020.
Together, the 15 countries make up close to 1/3 of the world population and the world's GDP. That's larger than the other regional trading blocs such as the European Union and the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. Backing the trade deal, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has urged Asian cooperation against global instability. But despite progress made in the negotiations, India is holding out for better terms. The mega deal started with 16 countries, but India opted against the trade pact over concerns that it would hurt its domestic producers. Negotiators from China and 10 ASEAN countries, as well as Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, are pressing ahead while leaving the door open for India. It's hoped cutting tariffs under the agreement would lower prices for trade while boosting competitiveness and exports for the world's largest trading bloc, with Asia at its center.
For more on the future of RCEP, let's turn to our panelists. In New Delhi, we have Dipankar Banerjee, Senior Strategic Consultant and former Director and Head of the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. In Kuala Lumpur, we are joined by Dr. Azmi Hassan, a Senior Political Analyst. In Beijing, last but not least, Ms. Rong Ying, Vice President of CIIS, which is the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Now, Mr. Rong, how much potential are we seeing in reaching a real final deal regarding RCEP, as earlier we have some bumpy road, shall I say it that way, with India apparently trying to withdraw?
Well, of course, yes, this is a big event for a regional trade arrangement, and certainly if we had India on the board, that would be even great. But even without India, I think so far, which is a question mark, I think RCEP is going to be a big and the largest, actually, the trading bloc, as we known, that would bring ASEAN, would bring Japan, bring China, and others together. That it is a very, I think, important message, positive message as a world.
I see.
Undergoing a lot of uncertainties, and that shows ASEAN as a whole, it can play a role in bringing these differences together, but they also, I think, China and others that are working together to make sure that the region as a whole will work together.
I see. Mr. Hassan, as we know, the RCEP was being discussed under a very different situation this time. Apparently, on December the 10th, the appellate body of the World Trade Organization already paralyzed as a result of new judge being appointed to satisfy the daily operation of the body. Therefore, the teeth of WTO has so far apparently lost. So, Dr. Hassan, at this point, would the economies, as we mentioned earlier, be able to bring out an option for the region and the world? What is your assessment?
Yeah, I concur with you that WTO, I think, having problem trying to pull out its own trade rules. And I think with the conclusion of RCEP, hopefully January or coming this February, it can show to the world that with a diverse country in RCEP, we have developing countries, we have developed countries, and we have superpowers like China and Japan and South Korea. We can work together with the background of US-China trade war, where US in particular has been embarking a unilateral decision, or as they say right now, is a protectionism, I think RCEP is a big deal. It shows to the world that a deal can be reached, even though at the beginning of the discussion, there are a lot of problems. But up until today, I think 90%, 95% of the problems have been solved.
Mr. Hassan, if I could just follow up very briefly, do you think economies remain optimistic under the current circumstances about a potential RCEP?
Yes, I'm very optimistic, for example. Because, I say that there are a lot of differences, not only in terms of scale of economy within the 15 nations, but also the political ideology, political system are very different for a country in the 15 RCEP, but they can come together and agree. The main problem is that, or the main good thing about RCEP is that they start from the lower benchmark. I think that's very different from CPTPP or from WTO rules. That's the reason I said I'm very, very optimistic that RCEP can show how the world can conduct trade in the future.
Mr. Banerjee from India, I'm not here to isolate you in terms of a question, but rather to ask sincerely, what are some of the concerns of India so far? Because apparently, according even to the spokesperson of China's Commerce Ministry, other economies are also trying to work with India in order to put out a possibility to involve all kinds of parties within the earlier discussion round of RCEP. So, Mr. Banerjee, to what extent do you think India should join the overall discussion and possibly a discussion leading to a great result?
I want to assure of the panelists as well as your larger audience around the world that India is positive regarding joining the RCEP. India believes in free trade agreements, and it entered into this dialogue last 6 years ago in a very positive outlook. India looks towards the east, the Far East and Ulk East policy, foreign policy of India, and so therefore India RCEP is an important treaty for India. But of course, as with all treaties, there are issues that have to be discussed, resolved, and especially on treaties on trade, free trade agreement, there are vital issues which affect the domestic constraints, their economic development, and the whole nation's future progress. So, India has certain concerns, and therefore these concerns are being actively discussed. It is not closed. India will come into the RCEP discussion whenever conditions improve or there is encouragement that some of the concerns of India are being addressed, and India remains bullish regarding the treaty. However, and of course one must accept that RCEP is going to be a very major free trade agreement, but without India it will not be as substantive as it ought to be.
Of course, if RCEP does not have India join, it will also be a loss for India, many would argue, if there were an RCEP for the future. Mr. Rong, I want to come back to you and Mr. Hassan as well. Now, both of you are coming from countries that are enthusiastic about an RCEP, even for the current stage. So, without earlier described to the public clearly what the concerns are specifically from India, Mr. Rong, to what extent do you think the other economies will try to incorporate and address all the concerns from the economy of India?
I think certainly other economies, including China, understand the concerns or the difficulties facing India. And not only, I think, economically and also politically, as we have seen after the decision was made, there's a kind of a debate on the one hand, but it also means a lot of sort of praise to the Modi, Prime Minister Modi. So it's becoming very much politicized an issue. But as far as the negotiation goes, even though I think the communique the leaders at the community agreed that they would work together to address the concern. But any negotiation has to be based on fair and terms. So I think certainly the other 15 members will continue to work with Indian colleagues in the hope that their concern will be addressed. But I would also say that to be fair, India will also have to work hard to play its role.
Yeah. Mr. Hassan, now RCEP very much has been a strong role played by ASEAN countries, and now you yourself is coming from one of those important ASEAN economies. So how do you think about the quote-unquote concerns, and what do you make of the consensus already being reached so far regarding the importance of RCEP, whether it's just about trade, it's also about other aspects that we have to deal with all at the same time, if you look at the world politics now?
The problem with ASEAN that we have an ASEAN economic community, but that cannot be achieved 100% because of the disparity between the 10 nation ASEAN. I think that's a big issue now. Now with RCEP, we have China, Japan, South Korea as a big and superpower in economy, and also Vietnam recently has concluded their free trade agreement with EU. And I think if we combine it together, I think RCEP have been very accommodating with ASEAN, especially countries such as Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, where they are more developing status. And I think some say that RCEP, China will benefit most. I don't agree with that. I think ASEAN too can play a big benefit, can get a bigger role in this particular matter. So I think RCEP for ASEAN is a very big issue, and we hope to see it concluded in the next few months, and also to show the world that what is multilateral trade is all about.
I see. If I could, Mr. Hassan, a follow-up. Even though one wants to put aside the geopolitics, when a trade and economic community such as RCEP is being discussed, but we are not living in a world with only one issue. So, Mr. Hassan, how do you think economies that are now in discussion about RCEP will be able to sharpen their judgment in terms of what kind of trade and economic environment they want to create, even in a very complicated geopolitical situation right now?
It's true that it's a very complicated world right now. But again, you look what happened to CPTPP, United States, it's too radical. That's the reason why they pull out from TPP, the first TPP. But again, I would say that RCEP shows that, I think, as mentioned before, this is bigger than EU. It's more complicated than USMCA. But again, we can reach to the agreement because there are a lot of give and take here. And I agree with Mr. Banerjee that India has its concern. That's the reason a lot, I think, have to be give and take in this particular issue. And it is a very complicated world. Not to mention with South Korea and Japan, they have their own problem. But RCEP shows that it can be resolved or minimized the conflict.
Mr. Rong, what do you think? Can RCEP be able to proceed even with this very complicated geopolitical situation? There are always, under complicated geopolitical situations, some parties want to take advantage of that. Some parties see it should be as far away from it as possible. Mr. Rong, what do you think?
That's exactly, I think, why we are welcome the RCEP, because the region as a whole has been so complicated, so diverse, and the ongoing geopolitical rivalries, and which is poised or in the risk of dividing or tearing this region apart. Now we have this RCEP, this regional trade bloc. I mean, despite the differences, despite the problems, and we are talking about, then now I think it's going to bring together, integrate together, us together, so that we can show, we can work together in the sense that despite the differences, and we still want to work for the, and this as a matter of fact, that's exactly, I think, what make the region as a whole being successful. I mean, continued peace, prosperity, and that is exactly, I think, the hope, where the hope is.
Mr. Banerjee, final words, very briefly. We only have 30 seconds left. Mr. Banerjee?
India is positive regarding RCEP. Yes, there are a few issues that need to be resolved, but India remains positive regarding the RCEP. With India's membership, RCEP will be the largest free trade agreement region of the world.
All right.
It's enormous potential. India's market will be more open to the rest of the Asian countries, and we look forward to a bright future.
Deepankar Banerjee, Azmi Hassan, and Rong Ying. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your input. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel, Twitter and Facebook accounts as well. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.